start the first session of the conference, which is on climate justice, legal and policy challenges in the face of a climate emergency. This is a panel that features exceptional experts. It will be moderated by Dr. Maira Hayat, Assistant Professor of Environmental Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Hayat is an anthropologist. She's also a LUMS alum, and I was very happy to find out that her first book, The Work of Water, is under advanced contract at the Stanford University Press. So congratulations. Welcome, Maira. We're thrilled to have you here. And I will now hand it over to you to introduce our esteemed panelists.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Thank you, Farah, for the introduction. I'm Maira. Can I invite my co-panelists to also share the stage? It's less stressful for everyone. You are also equally stressed, so please. Thank you to the conference organizers for all their work in getting us together. Thank you to everyone who's here for your time. I'm truly honored to be a part of this conference and also this panel. Our other panelists are Justice Syed Mansoor Ali Shah and Saad Gulzar. Justice Shah is a senior puisne judge of the Supreme Court of Pakistan. His judgments cover environmental sustainability, environmental and climate justice, and their implications with human rights. Saad Gulzar is assistant professor of political science at Princeton University. I'll go first. My aim is a simple one of trying to trace and understand how development imaginaries, in particular historical moments, have imagined, constructed, and used water. My presentation has three parts. Part one will introduce the Indus Water Treaty as an infrastructure and geography creating event, as a bordering practice. Part two will then outline the discontents the treaty generated in East Pakistan. I will end with an ethnographic narration to show how climate imaginaries are taking shape. Amjad Islam Amjad's drama serial Waris aired in 1979 and is considered to be one of the most popular Pakistani dramas. The story goes that when it first aired, once every week at 8 p.m., the roads would empty as people gathered in front of television sets. I'm very interested in your Waris stories, by the way, so if you have different ones, I'd be very happy to hear them later. Waris is set in a village called Sikandarpur. Chaudhry Hashmat rules over Sikandarpur. Chaudhry Hashmat is a guy in the middle. When his village, one of 500, comes within the boundaries of a proposed dam site, he tries convincing other villagers to protest to the government that the dam site be changed. He also puts pressure on political and administrative elites. Throughout the drama, we see his tactics come to naught. Modern subjects, including his own sons who have left Sikandarpur and moved to the city, try persuading him to accept the inevitability of the dam project, given that the government and international actors like the United Nations have finalized the location. Please, to which Chaudhry Hashmat responds with derision. Tum logon se dam idhar se udhar nahi hota. When one of his sons tells him the matter is above and beyond the commissioner, he demands to know who made the map for the dam. His son tells him foreign companies. Others urge him as the drama unfolds to recognize that the dam is a national need. But Chaudhry Hashmat is unable to separate the land, sometimes the village, sometimes Zameen, sometimes his ilaka, from his self. Frequently, he equates himself with Sikandarpur and vice versa, and the city with a bheed in which he will be lost. To which his loyal servant, one of the drama's heroes, played by the acclaimed actor Abid Imam, responds, "No, you find your identity in the crowd." Chaudhry Hashmat personifies the stereotype of the ruthless feudal landlord. From having pedigreed dogs picked up by force from the houses of urban elites in Lahore, locking people up in an underground cellar, sheltering a son accused of raping a girl in the village, and mocking, flouting, and frustrating police authority repeatedly. Shown in a positive or at least sympathetic light are the new authority figures. Policemen, members of the judiciary, the new publics, college-going girls and boys, salaried urban dwellers, business owners, and new procedures and norms of justice, equality, and due process. If the post-colonial promise was a promise of modernity, the modern in Waris is decidedly urban. In the last episode, the final scene shows Chaudhry Hashmat locking himself up in the cellar and drowning with the waters just before the dam is opened. In ending his life, he refuses a subject position the new post colony offers him. The drama masterfully entangles all this in a tale that is as much about family and land ownership as a masculine relationship as it is about national development, rural backwardness, and the post colonial promise. In one scene, the village master says to Chaudhry Hashmat, who ridicules a kammi's son upon gaining a law degree, God has given the right to advance to people. It is how this world progresses. The dam presents the triumph of the urban, the industrial, and the modern. Its appropriate subject positions, locations, styles of being and governing. The drama also equates the rural and agricultural with the feudal, the colonial, and with everything that is or should be passed for the country to progress. In this move away from land based livelihoods, including irrigated land, to city based ones, the drama shows a dematerialized view of progress, one where the materiality of food production is not addressed. Is the dam going to increase the area under cultivation? How are the cities being fed if villages are being submerged? Is food production being displaced? Where to? What about the thousands of miles of canals, link canals, and waterways that the dam will supply water to? Just 3 years before the drama aired, Tarbela Dam on the river Indus was completed. Tarbela, the world's largest earth-filled dam, built as part of the Indus Water Treaty, entailed pouring 45 million cubic yards of concrete and nearly 200 million cubic yards of earth fill. It submerged 52,000 acres of land, and at the time it was very common to see it described in the press, internationally and nationally, as the largest earth-moving task that had ever been undertaken. A recent dissertation by Muhammad Kamran, completed at the University of Peshawar, puts the number of people displaced at over 90,000. Mangla, built some years earlier, displaced nearly 200 villages to create the reservoir at the dam site. 65,000 acres of land were submerged. The treaty and the infrastructure it ultimately authorized represented the abandonment of proposals to develop the Indus Basin as a shared unit in an integrated fashion by India and Pakistan. Much has been written about this, in particular on how the dispute fed into Cold War era anxieties and became legible to the US as a communist threat. So I won't belabor the point except to note that the treaty mandated the division of Indus rivers into western and eastern ones. Partition, as historians have shown us, was only begun in 1947. Its bordering infrastructures and effects, its materializations, plot extended timelines. I've written elsewhere that this irrigation infrastructure building was a bordering practice, but this is only one part of the story. The other part is an abstraction story. The reference to water and volumetric units in proprietary Eastern and Western labels, in conceptions of your rivers and our rivers, abstraction because the treaty cannot acknowledge that the waters being divided flow through and in Kashmir. So that the management of water today is the management of these numbers. This is how irrigation engineers, my research interlocutors for close to a decade now, conceptualize the good or the resource that they are administering. Consider, for just one example, the elaborate flood water data sharing regime that is coming under increasing strain as the climate changes and the geopolitical response. In 1989, the Indian and Pakistani commissioners for Indus Waters reached agreement on an arrangement for the communication of flood flows information from July 1 to October 10 every year. In addition to broadcasting meteorological and flood data and priority flood telegrams, India would communicate flood data for the river Ravi to Pakistan on the telephone at 6-hour intervals for discharges between 30 to 100,000 cusecs of water, at 3-hour intervals for discharges between 100 and 200,000 cusecs of water, and hourly discharges for discharges exceeding 200,000 cusecs. This data sharing was discontinued in 2017. Part 2. I'll now turn to another front of discontents around the treaty and the infrastructure it enabled. Unfortunately, that's the end of my slideshow. On 7th December 1962, Pakistan's National Assembly held a session. Abdul Bari, a member of the legislature from East Pakistan, lamented, now that WAPTA has bustled in with their entourage of American experts, the cost of installation of a tube well has doubled to 60,000 rupees. Syed Abdul Sultan said, this cannot be imagined for a free country. The government should realize that unless development projects of East Pakistan are given the same treatment as those of West Pakistan, there can be no real progress. Begum Ruqayya Anwar asked, should our countrymen be allowed to be victims of this national devastation, even in this age of science? We refuse to believe that floods cannot be controlled. Ahmad Ali Mondal said, If our present government fails to control flood, they have no right to occupy the chair. Why should it not be possible for our government to control floods in our country if it could be possible for the Chinese to control the flood of the Wango River, which was the cause of their miseries? Abdul Qadir, then finance minister, responded, all these speeches have been based on sentiments, but sentiments alone cannot regulate the business of the government. The government has to proceed on practical measures. A finance minister needs cold figures. This is not the first time that floods have come to East Pakistan. East Pakistan is prone to floods. There are certain natural circumstances which make this province amenable to floods, end quote. But the nature as alibi argument did not hold for long. If development in countries like Pakistan was why disciplines like development economics grew, by the 1970s, their failures were occasioning, to quote Albert Hirschman, a drastic transvaluation in the discipline. This transvaluation, wrote Hirschman, one of the most prominent names in the field of development economics, and a contemporary of Amartya Sen and Mehboob ul Haq, I'm quoting Hirschman, has been forced upon us by a series of disasters that have occurred in countries in which development seemed to be vigorously underway. The civil war in Nigeria and the bloody falling apart of Pakistan are only the most spectacular instances of such development disasters. In his plenary at the 12th World Conference of the Society for International Development in Ottawa in 1971, Haq asked, while growth rates have been respectable in the 1960s, has any of it made a dent on mass poverty or on employment and equality of opportunities? He went on, per capita income disparity between East and West Pakistan had nearly doubled, and concentrations of industrial wealth became an explosive economic and political issue. And in 1968, while the international world was still applauding Pakistan as a model of development, the system exploded, not only for political reasons, but for economic unrest. For Haq, it was time to stand economic theory on its head. I quote, the search for a new perspective on development has already begun in the developing countries. Many of us who are essentially products of Western liberalism and who return to our countries to deliver development have often ended up delivering more tensions and unrest. And we stand today dispirited and disillusioned. It is no use offering us tired old trade-offs and crooked-looking production functions whenever we talk about income distribution and employment. It is no use dusting off old theories and polishing up old ideas and asking us to go and try them again. It is time that we take a fresh look at the entire theory and practice of development. In May 2014, Pakistan's Ministry of Planning, Development and Reform approved the national planning document, Pakistan Vision 2025. The document reads, every nation aspires to become a developed country. Pakistan was on the way to becoming a developed nation during the early 60s, but lost its way. Later, during the early 90s, it again led the way in South Asia, but again within a decade lost its direction. It is said that if everything is lost, the future still remains, end quote. But futures are made with pasts and in the present, and Pakistan's designs on water have much insight to offer. At Pakistan's inception, our enemy number one was waterlogging and salinity. General Ayub Khan wrote to President Kennedy. A scientific mission was appointed to survey and inventory Pakistan's water resources. And the 1960s and 70s were the heyday of groundwater plumbing technology and massive subsidies for tube well installation and electrification. Today, the Indus Basin is the world's second most stressed aquifer. Will the future of climate politics in our region continue to be mediated through securitized imaginaries and infrastructures? Our national water policy urges rapid development and management of water resources on a war footing. But then, more modestly, it notes that while water is a national responsibility after the 18th Amendment, agriculture and irrigation are provincial subjects. Declaring that, I quote, the most important instrument of mitigation against the impact of climate change on water resources is storage, end quote, it offers the modest recommendation to provinces to formulate their own master plans. Part 3, by way of concluding. The first narration is from winter 2018. There is a slight tremor in his right hand as he reaches over to take a biscuit from the plate placed on his large desk between us. He says it when he picks up the biscuit. We laughed, played, lived together, but I don't remember we ever ate together. He bites into the biscuit, tiny crumbs flying around his mouth, then says, all these years have taught me a lesson. Hindu kabhi aapka bhala nahi chahega. He rubs his fingers together to shed the crumbs or the distrust. Amir Sahab is in his 80s. Before partition, he lived in Jalandhar. As a government engineer, he has worked with his Indian counterparts on river sharing for over 5 decades. Every morning, he walks 3 flights of stairs to his office in the irrigation department, carrying all those years, all that distrust. Number 2. This is from the summer of 2019. This morning, we're at a government engineering academy where he's delivering a lecture. India can use the Indus Water Treaty as a weapon against us, right? It can flood us whenever it wants, asks an eager 20 or so years old civil engineer under training. Amir Saab responds, they can't flood us, but they can eventually cause us to be in a drought. As of now, for about 5 days, they can deprive us of water. Completely. Bilkul. Totally. There is silence in the large auditorium. All names, by the way, are pseudonyms. Then he says, to deal with this threat, we are making that link canal. Wapta is making it as I speak. The young men thump on their desks, some clap. Thank you. I will now request Saad to present, take 15 minutes, and then Justice Shah will close our panel.
My presentation is going to be on air pollution. As I present, notice how many of you are coughing in this room and how many of you are wearing masks. I noticed 3 masks in the room. So hopefully that'll give you an indication of where things stand. So this paper is called Bureaucrat Incentives Reduce Crop Burning and Giant Mortality in South Asia. It's a joint work with Gemma De Papa at Brown University and was just published in Nature at the end of October. And apologies to those of you who've seen a 2-year-old version of this at the first iteration of this conference. So in this paper, we're trying to study the causes of air pollution and what can be done about reducing the amount of pollution that we're all breathing in. Pakistan, along with India, shares an airshed. We have 42 of the 50 most polluted cities in the world. So at least, in our constant struggles to be number one in something, we're definitely number one in the most polluted region, air polluted region in the world. And of course, given that 1 in 4 people live in this region, this is a health emergency, a catastrophe. So every single resource that we have should be deployed at this stage to control this problem. But most of the measures that we actually see in practice are coming after the fact, not beforehand. There are common sources of air pollution such as car emissions, industrial emissions, etc. What I focus on in this paper is the phenomena of crop burning, agricultural stubble burning. It's a little uncommon in the sense that fewer people are aware of it as a big source of pollution, particularly in Pakistan in the winter months, which we're going through right now, where a large fraction of air pollution actually is caused by this phenomenon, not just in cities but also in the rest of the space that we all live in. So just to give you a crash course in the issue. Green Revolution incentivized a lot of agriculture in the area, a lot of intensive agriculture, and it led to the rice wheat cycle, and that created a lot of pressure on farmers to get rid of the stubble that's left over after the harvest of the rice crop. Now, farmers need to clear rice quickly to catch the monsoons for the next crop, which is usually the winter crop. And there are some other additional pressures that increasingly are causing them to do it very quickly. For example, on the Indian side, there have been a few water conservation legislations in the mid 2000s, around 2008, which have necessitated that they adopt some quick solutions to clear the stubble. In addition, using mechanized systems like the happy seeder, etc., are very expensive, and it's not tenable for farmers to use these systems to remove the stubble. So, of course, what they do is what's individually rational for them, which is to burn the stubble that's left over. Of course, while it's individually rational, there's a huge cost that's sent to people who are downwind from the farmer. And when millions of farmers are burning collectively, you can imagine that the amount of pollution that's displaced to people who are downwind is massive. And there are estimates which suggest that even if you pay farmers the full amount that they need to hire harvesters, etc., from a social planner's perspective, it makes complete sense that you do so because of the amount of pollution that's sent downwind from each single act of crop burning. You've all seen photos like this, what skies look like on a clear day. This is actually from Lahore during the smog season and outside. But you can see similar photos from each of the 42 most polluted cities in the world. So, solutions have been proposed. For example, we can pay farmers, we can implement some other policies like staggering burning, etc., etc. What I propose in the paper is that any solution that you can think of will require some kind of government action, and understanding what incentives exist for government bureaucrats and other agencies to actually act is very important for us to actually understand what those are. Um, from a governance perspective, agricultural burning introduces some unique challenges. First of all, crop burning, there are thousands or millions of dispersed agents who are each individually burning. And from a policy perspective, each burning itself doesn't contribute a lot to the total problem, which creates this problem that there's low marginal value of controlling any specific farmer. Okay. And then, of course, on top of that, when you add this idea that bureaucrats are already overloaded with work, why must they exert all this action to control a particular agent who's burning when the marginal value of stopping it is not very high? So this is a problem that's increasingly being considered intractable, but hopefully in this paper I'll show you that in fact there's a lot of change we can actually affect now on the ground as we think of more structural solutions in the medium to long run. So what we study is if bureaucrats can actually curb polluting behavior and under what conditions. So all of the data, I'm going to move pretty fast. If you are interested in the technical details, you should have a look at the paper. There are also some commentaries online on this paper by other senior scholars who have tried to decipher the paper in lay terms. So I'm going to try to move fast, but feel free to ask questions afterwards. We're going to use satellite data that come from NASA that help us to detect each instance of fire or crop burning from satellites. We're also going to use wind patterns from this European Space Agency data. And we're going to focus on this area which comprises the bulk of crop burning, which is in the northern Indian subcontinent, including the Pakistani Punjab. Now, in this area, which is marked in green, I'm going to be able to study every single district, which is marked in blue over here, both on the Indian side and also on the Pakistani side. And then inside each district, there are going to be various locations, and I'm going to try to think about what incentives each bureaucrat and their team have inside the district to control crop burning in particular regions versus the other. Okay, so when do bureaucrats exert control over crop burning? The objective is going to be to establish if a particular location, which I'm going to call a grid, is a source of pollution for the bureaucrat's own jurisdiction, or if pollution is going to be carried to a neighboring jurisdiction. And that's going to determine whether, or theoretically, that's going to determine if bureaucrats should care about controlling crop burning or not. And this is a big problem with air pollution because the polluting act is not necessarily where the pollution itself is observed. And that creates a big governance challenge because while we are organized in spatial jurisdictions, the problem actually encompasses much larger jurisdictions. And so what I'm going to do is to try to make you think about the following, which is imagine that this is a district and this is an actual district in UP in India. Imagine if there's a crop burning incident in this area, and if wind is blowing in this direction, then let's say all of the area in red gets polluted or bears the brunt of the air pollution, whereas the area in white does not. So in this particular crop burning, this particular area, the bureaucrat should care about because a large fraction of their jurisdiction is getting the brunt of the pollution. Now imagine if the air is still going in the same direction, but there's crop burning on this end, then a smaller fraction of the bureaucrat's area is getting polluted and a larger fraction is not. So in relative terms, the bureaucrat should care less about controlling this crop burning versus crop burning in this area. Now, obviously, winds are not stationary in terms of their direction, so if the wind shifts, the same location then becomes important for the bureaucrat because now a larger fraction of the bureaucrat's area is being polluted from the same location. So changes in wind direction are going to give me the leverage that I need to study incentives from bureaucrats' perspectives, which is I'm going to be able to say that if the same location becomes a source of pollution for the bureaucrat such that a larger fraction of their own jurisdiction is getting polluted versus not, are they going to exert more effort in controlling that crop burning pattern or not? So that's exactly what I do. Here's a map of the area that I'm studying, and you can see all of the areas in November of 2012 are the areas which pollute my own jurisdiction as the bureaucrat more than my neighbor's jurisdictions. And all of the areas in white are areas that pollute my neighbor's jurisdiction more than my own jurisdiction. So I should care about controlling pollution in the blue areas. And as winds shift, you can imagine these blue and white areas moving over time to different locations. And that's again the leverage that what I leverage to study the problem. So in this chart, what I plot are the differences between the blue and the white areas before and after wind shifts. So comparing places which will become a source of pollution for myself versus the ones that never become a source of pollution myself, you can see nothing really happens before the wind shifts. But as soon as the wind shifts and makes a place a source of pollution for my own jurisdiction, my own district, crop burning actually falls by about 15%. Okay, so these changes in wind direction that have nothing to do with actual crop burning patterns at the local level actually change the behavior of change the data that we see, which is crop burning actually immediately falls by about 15% and remains low for a foreseeable period of time. So this signals to us that bureaucrats in this large area, it's a huge area, hundreds of districts in this area, are able to exert some control over crop burning when it is incentive compatible for them to do so. Now, in the paper, we carry out a host of other tests, which I'm not going to have time today to talk about, but I've listed some of them here that I can quickly read through. So, what we find is that there is more crop burning when pollution goes to neighbors, and we can actually separate that there is less burning when pollution comes to the home district. Both of these effects actually increase as the strength of the incentive increases. So, how should you think about it? Well, the way to think about this is to go back to this chart, which is, that here there's a weak incentive for the bureaucrat to control because a very little part of their district is getting the brunt of the pollution. But as you keep moving inward to the interior of the district, then the incentive to control increases because then more and more of their jurisdiction is getting the pollution. And so in the paper, we show that as this incentive increases, crop burning actually reduces, and again because the bureaucrat is able to exert some control over the pollution. I'm also able to show that there is more pollution on the India-Pakistan border, considerably more pollution. And this is, somebody said 10 minutes just a second ago. But okay, I can move fast though. But this is the area where, unlike Maira's presentation, there is no airshed treaty between India and Pakistan. So there's no real mechanism of coordination across the jurisdictions. So a glass half full approach to what I just showed you is that all of these effects, all of the smog that we see, all of the crop burning we see, is after there is coordination between jurisdictions. Actually, that's a glass half empty approach. And things can be much worse, as you can see from the India-Pakistan border, because there is actually no coordination mechanism over there. So in some ways, we're already seeing the product of some coordination across jurisdictions in terms of controlling crop burning. I also show that the effects are obviously much larger as the area under rice cultivation for a bureaucrat increases. Again, the idea being that time-constrained bureaucrats have to rely more on these strategic calculations when they have to control a larger area that's going to be burning in their jurisdiction. And again, there is no such effect in the summer months when you also see crop burning with the wheat harvest, because nobody's talking about it and there's no policy pressure at that time, because often pollution at that period is not visible to the naked eye, even though AQI seems to be quite high if you look at satellite data. So we all are worried about smog in the winter months, but air pollution is a year-long phenomena now in Pakistan and South Asia, and particularly in the summer months with the summer harvest as well. So one observable implication of this is that what happens when bureaucrats do take action. Often people make this case that if if the marginal value of controlling a single act of crop burning is so low, why would we even encourage bureaucrats to start? So in the paper, we wanted to study this, and what we do is we actually get all FIR data from the Central Police Office in Lahore on crop burning. And on the Indian side, where the data quality is usually is much better, where we have court case data, actually the universe of court case data available online, we get all the cases that are registered in the Air Prevention Control Pollution Act of 1981. And so basically, these two sets of data give us information on when bureaucrats have taken action against crop burning. And what we're able to show is that first, there are obviously more penalties and more actions in rice areas during the harvest months, just sort of a sanity check that the data makes sense. But then we show that once punishment takes place, in the data, we can see that this punishment deters future farmers from burning in places where they anticipate further action by the bureaucrats. So again, the idea is that bureaucrats, by acting against crop burning in a particular location, can create deterrence amongst other farmers who might burn in the future. So now this gives us some policy leverage, because we can think about this idea that one action can have a spillover effect on deterring people from continuing to crop burn in their area. So putting all of this together, in the final part of the paper, nobody needs to be convinced that crop burning or smog in general has a huge impact on health. But in this part of the paper, what we try to do is we try to isolate the effect of crop burning from all other sources of air pollution that you see, especially, for example, in places like Lahore, where vehicular pollution is a big concern. So what we do is for each satellite image that we can detect of crop burning, we can actually estimate the pollution impacts through this high split model. It's a model that meteorologists use around the world. And so here I'm just plotting a few examples of crop burning. And each of these small circles are what are called demographic health survey cells. These are surveys that give you health data on child and mother health throughout South Asia and other parts of the world. So we have basically in these cells, we know when women, for example, are pregnant with children. And so what we can estimate is how much air pollution women who are pregnant are inhaling during their pregnancy as a result of crop burning, separate from all other sources of pollution. And that allows us to estimate the effect of crop burning specifically on infant and child health for those children whose mothers inhaled a lot of smoke during their pregnancy. So mortality per 1,000 births is already very, very high in South Asia. Here I'm plotting infant mortality, children who die before the age of 1. And here I'm plotting child mortality, children who die before the age of 5. So you can see about 40 out of 1,000 births are dying during the first or the first 5 years. Here I'm plotting the effect of a 1 log point increase in pollution to mothers who are pregnant during the 9 months of the pregnancy. And you can see that the effect almost, it doesn't quite double. There's about a 25 point increase from roughly doubling of the pollution during the pregnancy. So when pollution inhaled doubles approximately in the pregnancy, it is not exactly double, but roughly, that increases the rate of infant mortality from about 40 to something like 65. So if this chart doesn't alarm you, it should, because this is a huge increase in mortality in South Asia, and this is just one aspect of health effects. These are all of the children who are dying across South Asia from smoking, from inhaling smoke in utero, and many other effects like cancer, bronchitis. Half the room is coughing right now. That's because of smog. What is the effect of that on productivity, etc.? All of those are things that are very hard to quantify with specific sources of pollution. But at least there is one in this paper. At least we're able to show one aspect of this that's important. So just to conclude, the state cannot be avoided in any solution to the problem. In the data, we show that when it is incentive compatible for bureaucrats to act, they are in fact acting. And so ignoring them completely and thinking of this as intractable, I think, is the wrong move. And we should really think about bureaucratic incentives to control. It is important to consider the equilibrium effect of policies, where I showed you that punishing one farmer has larger returns through the creation of deterrents among other farmers. So thinking through these policies in sort of an equilibrium framework is important. And not the huge cost from not acting or continued inaction. You can actually have, my paper hopefully shows that you can have substantial mitigation while you start thinking about the underlying structural reasons, such as what the Green Revolution did to the state of agriculture in the area. But right now, if the only policy solution we can think of is smog towers, then I think we're kind of like putting our hands up and not actually doing something in the meanwhile and preventing all of these deaths. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. I just can't help saying that Chaudhry Hashmat, actually, how come he didn't know who could have actually moved the dam? He didn't reach out to the right people in this country. I'm no climate expert. I'm not a finance chap either. I'm just a judge, and I just share my perspective on climate justice as a judge, as how judiciary would look at it. And my emphasis post Baku, the judicial approach has changed. And I'll talk about that as to what the future line of action of climate justice would be in this country. And I'll also say that how actually climate justice or the decisions we've given have didn't really actually make any difference on the ground. There's a huge gap. There's a very robust and rich jurisprudence, but the ground reality is very different, very stark, and very depressing. So there is a huge gap. And I think I'll just try to identify why that gap is there. Other than the political will, there's another factor. So the entire emphasis of what I'm going to say today is that, to me, climate justice or climate finance is the new climate justice, actually. And I'll come to that in just a while. So we don't have any qualms about the fact that climate change is here for real. I mean, excluding Trump. Climate change is here for real, and it is the greatest existential challenge for our generation. Climate emergency underscores the urgent need for immediate action to face and fight climate change with even greater courage, intelligence, and creativity, and confront and combat escalating impacts of climate change. In Global South, including Pakistan, we see year after year the impacts of climate change are getting more intense. Every year, hundreds of millions of people endure increasingly extreme weather events, taking away precious livelihoods and lives, from posing issues such as intense droughts, water scarcity, severe fires, rising sea levels to flooding, melting of glaciers, catastrophic storms, and declining biodiversity. Pakistan makes a tiny contribution to total global greenhouse gases emissions, but it is amongst the countries most vulnerable to climate change, and it is the 8th most affected country due to climate change in the world. For Pakistan, the more immediate and pressing task is to prepare itself for adaptation to climate change and to attend to the loss and damage caused by the climate change, while simultaneously addressing other true planetary crises, the loss of biodiversity and the challenge of pollution and waste that we just heard about. I wish to underline that in the environmental cases of 1990s, courts, and why I talk about judiciary, because I think judiciary did take a lead on environmental movement in this country, and we have one of the leaders sitting right here, Dr. Parvez Hassan, and you can't forget Shah. These were our main iconic cases that moved the agenda. The Constitutional Court actually moved the environmental movement in this country. The executive didn't do much about it. I think it all came from the judiciary initially, and then sort of translated into climate justice, which I'll just explain in a while, how we moved on from environmental justice onto climate justice. I wish to underline that in the environmental cases of the 1990s, courts primarily focused on penalizing industries or polluters and directed governments to implement policy changes aimed at improving the environment. However, the critical aspect of finance, or more specifically nature finance, was never part of the discussion. And this is, in retrospect, I'm highlighting. The entire environmental justice movement that we had, where the polluter was in the country, scores of jurisprudential cases that have come out of Supreme Court and High Court, we never talked about who is going to implement those directions. How will they implement those directions? Other than the government or the political will, was there any finance with the government to deal with those issues? We never talked about finance, and that is something that's lacking. Today, it has become increasingly clear that without adequate financing, advancing the environmental agenda is simply not feasible. This realization has brought nature finance to the forefront of discussions, emphasizing that sustainable progress in environmental protection and climate action requires robust financial backing. Nature finance is now recognized as a cornerstone for achieving environmental and climate goals, highlighting a critical shift in our approach to addressing these challenges. But more of this in a bit. As opposed to environmental justice, which circled around polluter, climate justice unveiled an entirely new and complex canvas for us and the courts. The challenge lies in addressing the broader and more severe macro effects of climate change, such as extreme weather events that disrupt agriculture, health, food security, urban planning, building regulations, industrial licensing, technology, human resources, human displacement, climate-induced trafficking, disaster preparedness, and public health systems. Climate justice emerges as a broader and more nuanced framework than traditional environmental justice, especially for the Global South. While environmental justice primarily focused on the equitable distribution of environmental benefits and burdens, climate justice encompasses health security, food security, energy security, water security, human displacement, human trafficking, and disaster management, recognize the intricate interplay between these sectors. So a judge in Pakistan who is looking at climate justice is looking at a whole different world than a judge sitting in the north looking at climate justice, because he's just looking at mitigation, which is a very linear way of looking at climate justice. But I think the scope of adjudication in Pakistan changes when you look at climate justice in the global south. So for the global south, climate justice introduced a significant shift in jurisprudence. It demanded a more sophisticated and inclusive approach to adjudication, one that accounts for multidimensional impacts of climate change across multiple sectors. This necessitates remedies that go beyond retributive measures against polluters and instead adopts restorative and rehabilitative approaches. Courts are now required to design adaptive remedies to protect the rights and dignities of communities disproportionately affected by climate change. So we have to come up with how to come up with a more resilient urban planning, how to come up with a more resilient agricultural planning, climate resilient irrigation plans. This is something that we need to look at. We have a case that comes before us, does not talk about climate change. It might talk about irrigation and water scarcity, but actually you're looking at a climate change issue. There was a case that came to us that said that we want to expand the cement plant in Kalar Kahar, the DG cement case. There was nobody argued climate change in that case. They said we just want to add on, expand the cement plant in Kalar Kahar. And we said, no, Kalar Kahar is a water scarce area. And we did not allow that expansion. But hidden in that entire case was the whole concept of climate change, because it's a water scarce country. So this evolution of adaptive climate justice or adaptive jurisprudence, which just belongs to Pakistan or the global south, unlike the north, marks a pivotal moment in the legal landscape where the scope of justice is expanded to address interconnected challenges that were previously outside the purview of environmental law. We now suggest climate resilient urban planning, agriculture, irrigation, farming practices, etc. So the scope increases. If we examine the climate jurisprudence, we see that it has been largely directional. So what have we done in the last maybe 5-7 years? Coming up with very interesting jurisprudence, which has been globally quoted now, especially Asghar Laghari case and some of the others. People talk about it internationally. But what has happened in Pakistan? Has anything changed as far as climate justice is concerned? No, I would imagine. Because all we did was we gave directions. Please do fix this. Please go do fix this. Come up with a new plan to do this. But never figured out whether at all the government had political will, but that's aside, did they ever have the money to do this? Or did they have the budget to do this? We never talked about it. Somehow the government never raised this question before us either. So while the courts kept on directing in Asghar Laghari, DG Cement, and a number of other score of cases that we'll do this, CDA was directed to come up with a design which is climate resilient. All buildings in Islamabad should be urban climate resilient, but nothing really happened. The directions are there. They've been quoted all over the world. The jurisprudence is very robust and exciting, but nothing happens on the ground. So debate and discussion at the recent COP29 at Baku brought a fresh perspective of what is really not happening. To address these challenges, to achieve meaningful adaptation or to succeed in a claim for loss and damage caused due to climate change, climate finance becomes an indispensable lifeline. So climate change may be global, but the solutions are not shared equally. Those with resources hoard them, leaving the most vulnerable to perish, said Greta Thunberg. So for a country like Pakistan, which is highly vulnerable to climate change, the availability of robust financial resources is critical for building resilience and protecting its people. Climate finance supports adaptive measures like food defenses, flood defenses, drought-resistant crops, sustainable urban infrastructure, and community-based disaster response systems. Climate finance ensures that individuals can live lives marked by dignity and security, with access to basic needs such as clean water, safe shelter, reliable food supplies. So in essence, climate finance is not just an economic necessity. It is a moral imperative. It ensures that the most vulnerable, who have contributed the least to global emissions, have the resources to adapt, survive, and thrive in the changing world. For Pakistan, climate finance is not merely a tool for policy, it is the foundation of hope for the future, where every citizen can live with dignity, security, and promise of a better tomorrow. So climate finance is not about helping, it is about restoring justice in a system that is fundamentally skewed against the global south. Climate finance refers to what? Where do we get this climate finance? So climate finance refers to local, national, or transnational financing drawn from public, private, and alternative sources of financing that seeks to support adaptation actions that will address climate change. Its origins trace back to the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, which establishes the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. This principle acknowledges that while all nations share a common responsibility to combat climate change, developed nations bear a greater burden due to their historic contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. So ensuring climate finance, and this is the judicial approach, or at least how what we're thinking now, and I don't know how the executive looks at it, but this is how the judiciary is probably going to look at it. Ensuring climate finance is therefore the most pivotal part of climate justice. I think the next decade, the jurisprudence that's going to come out of Pakistan should be talking about how do we go about getting in climate finance and how best could we arrange that. So climate finance is actually our lifeline, if you look at it, that can help us strengthen our infrastructure, agriculture, water management, economic inequality, and disaster resilience. The climate finance is going to do all this. And it must be mobilized on an unprecedented scale and be accessible in a timely manner to those who need it the most. So without climate finance, our right to life, which is Article 9 of the Constitution, our right to human dignity, which is Article 14, is under threat to our understanding. Therefore, climate finance in countries from the global south like Pakistan is fundamentally a human right. And that's what I want to underline. I think climate finance is the new human right, and that has to be examined and looked at in that context of climate justice, as it is essential to preserving human life and human dignity. Human dignity has a major role to play when you're talking about displacement, when you're talking about your entire crops being totally destroyed, you don't know where to take your agriculture, where to go, and where to build a new livelihood. So if climate finance continues to fall short, the gap between developed and developing nations may grow, leading to what now some people term as climate apartheid, where wealthy nations protect themselves from climate impacts while poorer nations are left to bear the brunt. So where is this climate finance? And this is what I want to address and highlight. Climate finance would largely come from the global funds under the Paris Agreement. So we have the Green Climate Fund, GCF, very good, established under the UNFCCC to channel about $100 billion annually by 2020 to developing countries, as it said. Performance, they've just pledged $40 billion and far below its target. The issues, the disbursement rate is slow. Only 25% of the pledged funds have been disbursed. And I looked around and I looked at the architecture behind these funds. How do we access these funds? How do we reach out to these funds? What's the process? It's unbelievably difficult. You can't reach out to these funds. How do you go about it? How do you handle dispute settlements? How do you negotiate on this? Suppose you say our loss and damage or my adaptation budget is 20 billion and they say, no, we just think it's 10 billion. How do we settle that issue? Where does the issue of climate science come in? Is the country prepared with climate science to argue and articulate a claim before these international forums? So to me, it's like, truck ki batti ke piche hum lage hue hain. There is nothing that's coming our way. So I just want to highlight that this global finance that we're talking about, it's not actually trickling down. I mean, as a judge, I looked at, there are no procedures, there's no architecture, there's no regulatory framework on how does it actually go. It falls outside our jurisdiction, we can't really enforce it, for which I propose that there has to be an international climate court because there's no way you police all these things, but there is no mechanism available, and that sort of worries me because this is going on for such a long time and nothing is trickling down. Similarly, adaptation fund, so there is nothing really that's coming down. The loss and damage mechanisms are also there, but emerging under decisions made under COP27 to address irreparable climate losses in vulnerable nations. Now, let me highlight that loss and damage is an immediate requirement. You need that money immediately. We need $20 billion to fix the flood issue, you see. So that's the money that you require immediately, whereas adaptation could be slightly more continuous, slightly long term. But loss and damage is an immediate requirement, but nothing is actually coming our way. So as far as loss and damage is concerned, implementation is still in its infancy with no clear funding architecture or substantial disbursements. Highly politicized with donor countries resisting mandatory contributions. So challenges in accessing global climate funds, there are bureaucratic hurdles. Then we have stringent eligibility criteria which we cannot meet. Inequitable distribution, larger developing countries with better institutional capacities like India and Brazil often secure more funds, leaving smaller or more vulnerable nations behind. Small island developing states, SIDS and LDCs receive minimal funds despite being the most vulnerable. So power imbalance also, decision making in global funds is often dominated by donor countries with limited input from the recipient nations. So this goes on, and there's a slow disbursement rate as we look at it. That worries me, see. There's also a political resistance to this. What has been the response of the government? Well, I think they did put up a good show at Baku, and I think the current advisor to the Ministry of Climate Change, Mrs. Rumina Khalid, is trying to do as much as she can, and I compliment her efforts. But, there is nothing much that comes out. And I look at their official statement, and they say, we've just finalized the National Climate Finance Strategy. Very good. Where is it? What is it? I haven't seen it. It's just being finalized somewhere. So, and they say that we've applied, we've made applications to the Green Fund. Nobody gives a figure as to what money has actually come to Pakistan against it. And they keep referring to figures, and I don't want to bother you with those. It talks about a number of figures, but nothing really clearly shows what's the amount that has actually come to Pakistan. So this goes on. So what do we do then? We could have some other options also. Okay. Actually, I'm not used to this in the courts, but not part of my structure, so nobody tells me how much to speak, but I'll just shut up in just a while. So, no, so I'll just cut through this, but some of the initiatives that the government wants to take is to reach out to the vulnerable 20. V20 as is and we're trying to come up with a coalition of judges in the V20 countries and see if we can come up with a strategy on climate justice and see what climate diplomacy can go into it and see. But let me just quickly now, considering that I just have 5 minutes, I thought we could rely on alternative sources of Islamic finance. That's another big area, and there are a number of areas that you can go into that and see if we can raise money through Islamic finance, carbon markets. All of this is still in discussions. Nothing has really come through. Maybe some other Islamic countries have done this, but we haven't reached out and done that yet. So I just want to then quickly, as a conclusion, see as to what the approach of the judiciary is going to be as to what we can do about all this, because otherwise, the climate finance, as far as the executive and the government is concerned, I see that still there is no money. As I said, there could be domestic, you can raise money domestically through private players like the carbon markets. We could have the Islamic finance going. Let me also tell you that the Climate Finance Act 2017 talks about climate fund. And recently at the Supreme Court, we took up this case, earlier took up this case under the constitutional bench, to which I'm not yet a party. So now the new constitutional bench will look into it, but we're talking about there is no authority. The law came out in 2017. We're sitting in 2024. There is no authority, climate change authority, which is the apex body looking at climate change in Pakistan. So there is no authority. So the court reached out to the government and directed them to come up with an authority. They're still working on it and interviewing people how to get the authority in place, and maybe they will soon do it. The second question that we asked them in the court was that under the law, there is a climate change fund. Is there any money in the fund? Is the fund created? There is no fund established. Considering that climate change is the most serious existential threat Pakistan is facing, there is no climate change fund under the Climate Change Act 2017 as we speak, and nothing was allocated in the recent budget either, which is sad. So, secondly, there are no rules. Even if there was a climate change fund in Pakistan, how does an individual access it? If my lands have been destroyed because of climate change due to drought, how do I access the climate fund? What's the mechanism? What are the rules? What is the, how does this get, how do we work through this? We don't know. So the pattern globally, the pattern domestically is also the same as it is internationally. So what do we do? So how do the courts look at it? And that's, I think, we can kind of play a transformative role in this area. And that could be by considering, and I think the first and foremost is the recognizing climate finance as a fundamental right. So that's one, that's the beginning as far as we are concerned. I don't know what executive is doing and I don't know what the politicians are up to, but at the courts we think recognizing climate finance as a fundamental right is important, because right to life, right to dignity, even right to fair trial could come into it, and right to non-discrimination. Courts can recognize climate finance as a fundamental human right, emphasizing its necessity for the survival and development of vulnerable communities by establishing a clear judicial understanding that climate finance is tied to the right to life, health, and sustainable environment. Courts can push for stronger legal obligations for both domestic governments and international entities. We could also, as we're looking at it, we think that obligations of the global north be viewed as climate debt and push the governments to press their claims more forcefully. Climate justice focuses on climate finance and more so on reparative justice. So to my mind, climate justice now moves on to climate finance, but climate finance also further moves on to reparative justice, which focuses on compensating communities or individuals for harm caused by environmental degradation. So if the compensation isn't coming, then the entire literature, the entire debate is meaningless to my mind. So it has to be now, the future of climate justice is reparative justice. There has to be compensations coming our way so that we actually tangibly change things. The judiciary plans to have a serious judicial oversight over climate financing, pushing the government to making their claims internationally or even locally, but nothing so far has happened in that direction, but that can be done. So in addition to this, just last point, that in addition to climate change and our view of climate justice, we also want to view climate change as a part of the triple planetary crisis that UN has identified, which is climate change, loss of biodiversity, and pollution, which we just talked about. So I think we require nature finance, another initiative in the country, to look at pollution and to look at biodiversity loss, because they're all interconnected. Loss of biodiversity, pollution has a direct bearing on climate change, and climate change in reverse has a bearing on this. So this is how we can go about looking at the future by underlining that climate finance is something critical and most important, and we can't sort of possibly move without attending to the issue of climate finance. And I'll just end it with a quote from President of Kiribati, who said that the global south is tired of empty words on climate finance. We need accountability, fairness, and funds that address our realities, not token gestures. But that's where we stand today. Thank you so much.
I just want to thank our panelists once again. Thank you, all of you, for your attention and time. So the good news is that we have about 15 minutes for Q&A / conversation / back and forth. I thought the best way to do it would be to collect questions / comments, then give the panelists a chance to respond, and we can do 1 or 2 rounds depending on how much time there is. So if there are questions, please raise your hand, try to get someone's attention. And then, what is the plan? Then I will call on you and you should try to make yourself heard. There are also some mics here that can circulate. Okay, so I see you here. Sorry, I'm pointing to people. It's very rude. But can I ask you to go first? Then can I ask somebody here? I see the lady there. That's two people. And can we maybe have a third person from here? And I see a lady here. So three, we'll collect three and then we'll have responses and then maybe another round. Go ahead. I'm referring to you. Yes, you're the person.
Okay, my first question is to Justice Shah, simply because this is one of the few opportunities that we get to ask judges questions. While we wait for climate finance to come in, while we wait for that conversation to happen, should judicial interpretation not shift towards reviewing the current money that the government is spending from a climate sensitive lens? Should the current traditional practices of how the limited funds that our governments have available to it are being dedicated, should that not become part of judicial review as well? Any particular project of the government that is being undertaken, is it cognizant of environment and climate concerns? So should jurisprudence also not start evolving to that point? That's my first
I
question.
can't agree more, but it has to be done by the constitutional bench of the day. So if they want to do it, they can do it. We're not on it, so we don't know. So yes, I fully agree. I mean, you need to push it in that direction. That has to happen that way. But still, I think largely it's a policy issue for the executive. I think we can't really design their financial allocations and how they want to go do it. But we've been sort of butting into a number of policy issues earlier, so we might do this at times. But yes, it could be an area that we could consider at some stage. But yes.
All right. My second question is to Saad. Given that farmers have sort of tradition in the last 2-3 years, they've become the real scapegoats on the air quality conversation. And I know this is a loaded statement in itself that they've been made scapegoats, because there is data to suggest that they have a significant contribution. But that contribution is really over a period of 2 to 3 weeks, twice a year. Yet we see air quality being a problem consistently throughout the year. So perhaps targeting this one community, which is already pretty vulnerable, and in coming up with models which are suggestive that perhaps some harsher penalties are required to create a deterrent on this already sort of vulnerable community or underprivileged community. Do you not think that would be more counterproductive, even at a policy and governance level?
Do you want me to answer? Or?
Can I ask you to hold off? Can we hear from? Yes, go ahead. So we'll collect three more and then you'll have a chance to respond. Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. My question is for Justice Mansoor Ali Shah Sahab. One of the outcomes of Pakistan's extreme vulnerability to climate change is the increase in the number of climate migrants. Over the next 5 years, the number is expected to be 1.2 million. Now, as a student of business, and I think as my interest is in a more data-centric approach, and I feel that if we have a proper definition of climate migrants as a legal definition and not just the one that we use in academic circles, we would be able to deploy our limited climate finance resources to serve climate justice to these vulnerable communities. So I would like to understand from you, what are the challenges that we face in not being able to come up with legal definitions so far, globally or nationally?
So we'll just take one more and then, yes, go ahead. Yes.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. I am Mehwish Sultan, Member Punjab Assembly from Chua Siddinshah Chakwal. And first of all, I would like to thank you all the panelists for your knowledgeable discussion and your debate. And my question is for Justice Mansoor Shah Sahab. As you have mentioned in your talking points about the cement plants and their issues, and I would like to ask you the same question. I remember Supreme Court has taken suo motu about the Katas Raj pond, which were dried up. And I believe, I don't know where it was ended, because Probably it was ended on a compromise between the Supreme Court or the cement plant, because the Qatar Start pond still has no water, and they were supposed to bring the water from the Jhelum River, which they never did. So I would like to ask you comment, or maybe you can answer. Thank you very much.
Before I forget all the questions, guys. So, answering that question first, we don't have a case so far before us regarding the migrants issue, but yes, if one comes up, I think a definition would be required or explanation would be required. Yes, so we'll do that once the matter comes up. But yes, I agree with you that I mean, we're trying to put as much, climate finance into all the relevant areas, but such a case hasn't yet come before us as to how to allocate climate finance and look at finance and the challenges of climate as yet. But sooner or later, when it does come up, I think there'll be time to go ahead and define climate migrant also, climate refugee also, a number of other things. But I was just saying about all these things a bit ahead of the curve in the sense it hasn't happened yet. But sooner or later, it'll be required. And I see in the next decade, the jurisprudence ought to flow in that direction as I see it. As judicial approach is going to be towards climate finance, because without that, nothing can happen actually. So you have to kind of wait and see what happens sooner or later. As to your comment, firstly, we don't have a suo motu power anymore. If that makes you happy. That's been taken away in this the latest 26th Amendment of ours, which is equally big as the climate change issue. In that case, a suo motu was taken and they directed that yes, water ought to be brought in and the temple ought to be filled with water. I think it never happened. It never happened. Indirectly, another case came before me was the DG Cement case, where they were trying to expand the cement plant. And it was interconnected with that issue because the water had dried in the area and the government had stopped the expansion of the cement plant because of the reason that there was no water in the area. And one example was that the temple had all dried up. So we said no, and we brought in the climate angle. And even though the cement plant had argued at that time that we'll bring water and we'll make pools and we'll do this, and that they could not do either. So I think it just went nowhere. I mean, it was just a direction in the air and nothing happened. So that's also something that I was talking about, that there is a lot of difference in giving directions and what happens on the ground. And in order to even fill those tanks with water, you required a lot of design and sort of a lot of money to do this. I don't know how would that be achieved, and the government probably didn't really say anything about it. So my understanding is that that just disappeared. And this is the sad part of the suo motu part also. I mean, directions which were not possible to implement. And so, yeah, that's the sad part, but that chapter is over, I guess.
Saad, do you want to respond? And then I think we have time for another round of questions.
So I think the farmer question is an important one. Of course, it's a vulnerable community, but first, from a legal perspective, the matter has already been decided. Crop burning is illegal. So the legislators or our elected representatives have made the call that this is something that needs to be prevented. But I think from another perspective, from a public social planner perspective, air pollution is the largest issue for us as a community right now. Several million people die every single year in South Asia, deaths that are directly attributed to poor air. And then there are many, many other deaths that we don't even know about, other public health diseases that we don't know about. So we have to go at this problem from every single angle that is possible. But of course, it is true that the populations that are most vulnerable are the ones that get the worst, the blunt end of the stick immediately. So we should be obviously cognizant of that. But I think the issue is that you have to kind of address this problem both in the short term and in the medium to long term. My research is focusing specifically on crop burning. That's not to say that other problems also are not the ones that need to be curtailed. But at least on the crop burning end, I hope that I've shown that there's a reasonable effect that you can have immediately with the existing governance institutions. And so you should do that and other things as well. I don't think it's an either or scenario anymore.
Okay, so we have time for one more round. We will collect them because we are short on time. So, aap jaye pehle, then it's your turn. 2, then it's your turn. 3. We'll do 3 and then we can do more. Sorry. Yes, 4. But let's do 3 first because we might be turned out of the room. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. At last year's Pathways conference, we presented a paper on climate finance, and I'd be happy to share it with you. Basically, there are going to be 2 sources of climate finance: private finance, and that'll come into lots of adaptation technologies, including energy. And that really will depend on what kind of improvements we make in our domestic governance framework under which foreign investment comes to the country. The second source is going to be concessionary finance. And that, as somebody said, depends considerably on how we'll manage our fiscal situation currently. So I'm afraid if you get into the area of climate finance, you will find judiciary coming into lots and lots of areas of economic governance, which from our angle is very welcome, but it may require another constitutional amendment.
You're next.
Mr. Saad, what is the solution of this farmers' stubble, rice and wheat stubble, other than burning? Is there any kind of education to the farmers? Is there any information? How would they deal with it? Rather than just punishing the farmers. I mean, that is, yes, punitive measure is there, but that is there's so many other problems.
Thank you. There's your number 3. Go ahead. And then number 4 here. उनको देंगे वो तीसरी रो में. हाँ जी.
Thank you very much, Ji. A small comment. As a former student of Shah, I also happen to be a regular visitor of a environmental bench headed by Justice Shahid Karim Sir, which happens to take up environmental issues every week. What I feel, and as an observer, is the civil society is not taking its due role. So that is also missing in the debate we are having. 2, a question to both. Very little has been talked about interest groups or property developers and their interest and their stake in the political scenario, whereby policy is tainted towards their interests. Water, as we know, is just not diverted towards agricultural side. It is also diverted towards the industrial side. So if there are challenges with regards to water and its treatment, the onus or the ownership also needs to shift to the industrial side and the housing schemes that we have seen mushrooming.
So we're taking a 4th question. अभी इधर बोलने की इजाजत नहीं है. You go ahead. Can we get a mic there? Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Sarah Sarnizamani. I am a social protection specialist and research fellow at IBA. My question can be answered by any of the panelists. In this room, the discussion is very much focused on ensuring climate finance, how is it our lifeline, and also the emphasis that how Pakistan is paying an unequal price. There's absolutely no denying in that. But in these conversations, should we not also acknowledge the mistakes that we have made as policy choices? For instance, renowned hydrologists, our local hydrologists tell us that we are 3% of world's population, but we are responsible for 5% of marine pollution. We put approximately 500 million gallon of sewage waste on Karachi's coastline every single day. I mean, 70% of world's oxygen comes from sea, not the trees. Similarly, the impact that projects like, for instance, LBOD, which is Left Bank Outfill Drain, a mega development project in the 90s, which was designed to drain excess water and improve irrigation, and now it floods half of the Sindh. And thousands of people are displaced because of that project. Similarly, we are also giving limited...
Sorry, can I ask you to wrap up?
Yes, direct information on environmental reviews in SIFC. So we do definitely need the money, but since we are in a local, our own conference, so should we not also make a shift in the way we think and execute policies? Thank you.
I think we just have time for our two panelists to respond. Unfortunately, हमें कमरा खाली करना है, but I'm sure the conversation can continue. So whoever wants to go
I think they
first.
were largely comments, very good comments, and I'll leave it to that. But I think what Dr. Nabi earlier said, I think that's a governance issue. And a governance issue is certainly a very serious issue. I mean, all these things that you've identified are very important. And we should address this. And that's for the executive and the governments of the day to consider. I was just giving a judicial approach to this as to how we could push things. And as rightly pointed out, that the third sector ought to be involved. And I was about to say that because of limitation of time, I couldn't. Because when the court sort of decides things and courts intervenes, it does mobilize public opinion. And that is very important. So yes, it's all interconnected. Governance is the heart of it, to my mind. Yeah.
I'll just add that our history of handling foreign aid isn't particularly very good. So I think keeping that in mind, climate finance is going to be foreign aid in some ways. So thinking about what our own history tells us is very important. The conversations we have locally, like in this room, are going to be very different from the conversations we have internationally, and keeping that perspective is going to be important. I'll quickly answer the crop burning alternatives question. There are many, many of them. For example, happy cedar is the common one that newspapers talk about all the time, which is a technical solution to the problem. You can also sell the produce as for biofuels. That's another one. And punitive solutions are just one aspect of it. Newspapers routinely cover bureaucrats providing information, appealing to sort of to religion, being pro-sociality of farmers to stop burning so that others downwind are not bearing the brunt. There's a whole suite of solutions. I guess the main point I was trying to make is that understanding the incentives of the government are going to be at the core of any solution that we can think of, whether they're punitive or not. And punitive solutions are the ones that I happen to have data on, in a data poor environment that we operate in over here. If we have systematic data on the other parts, I'd be happy to think through them as well.
I just comment on that question. I mean, recently in a Supreme Court case, we had this climate change case. We had asked all the provincial governments to tell us whether at all they have a climate change policy or a climate change plan. And you'd be surprised that once we asked them, they said we're just making one. And so, I mean, I thought that's not right. I mean, so I don't want to sort of blame anybody, but I'm just saying that they're not ready with it. They're not with it. And that we see, and I think the court at least plays a role in pushing them to do this, for which we need to understand economics, we need to understand climate science, and we need to understand this entire governance structure ourselves also, for which I think, we need to come up with some sort of plan on that account also. But increasingly we see that there is no great interest as far as climate interest. We actually not taking it as the most serious existential threat. We're not. There are other issues we're attending to. So at least the court is sensitizing and pushing the government to look into that.
I just want to thank you all for your time. I hope we can move the conversation outside the room. Thank you so much.